I've got a couple of things that I'm going to do right up front. One is a video. This isn't about our company so much. It's just it's a little bit about the demos that we deal with. And if you want to do anything in marketing, and if you want to do anything in marketing information, being well-grounded in demos around the world, changing populations, changing influence is a really important thing. And you would be shocked at how many people forget. They really do, because these things happen over long periods of time, and people forget that they're happening right in front of them. And so it's just an important perspective I want to share up front. And then really I have a few charts that just go over some subjects that I thought you might want to kick around. And then we can get to Q&A. So, well, what it's going to tell you, and it's a pretty simple notion, but again, I'm surprised at how many people forget. The biggest thing going on in your lifetime, the last 20 years of my lifetime, your kids' lifetime, of course, is population growth. You know, we're going to roughly double this population that it took all of human history to create in just 25 years. You're going to have billions of new consumers in all parts of the world. You're going to find out that almost all of the big population spurts are in places that can't afford to feed them, don't have enough water to quench their thirst. And you're going to find out that it's going to create huge streams of migration. Simple as that. You're going to have immigration issues and political fights almost everywhere in the world. You're going to see them. You see them right here in this country. They look like they're significant. Relative to other countries, they're probably not as significant. But what happens during all these big movements over long periods of time, roughly a couple of decades ahead of you, is you have just enormously changing dynamics, multicultural influences inside countries you think you know, perfectly developed countries, like the one we're here, that people just always underestimate. And when I'm out talking to CMOs, I wonder how many CMOs who came in here and talked to you talked about the Hispanic community and exactly what's required to service the Hispanic community in a much bigger, better way. Because that's the demo that matters. That's the one that's going to change everything in our country over the next 20 years. It already is influencing it in every way you can think of. But for whatever reason, because it unfolds slowly, I think, because there are political things that get in the way, like are we going to let them in, or should we send them all home? Because those are the subjects that get all the media attention. What I think a lot of folks miss is just that our underlying sort of cultural interests are changing at a very rapid pace. And if somebody said to me, Dave, go down to Procter & Gamble and do everything you can to create opportunity at P&G, I think the first move I would make would be to build a marketing organization around the Hispanic opportunity. So I understood it, I knew it, I could pursue it in a way that others don't. Anyway, that was really what this is about. It talks about the age of populations around the world. You guys all know the big ones, Japan and what's happened there. China is the one that is going to just stomp everybody in terms of big changing dynamics. Of course, with the one-child policy and the sheer numbers, you're going to see the most massive aging, again, in human history in one country. And the ability to cope with that is going to be a sort of a crapshoot, in my view. But all of that sort of is part and parcel to marketing, consumer insight, and in my view is still the driving force. And I think it's the thing you want to get grounded on right away. It's not terribly difficult to understand because it's a numbers thing. But the cultural influences and all the idiosyncrasies that go with it, in my view, are pure opportunity. Now I need to just go to these few slides. Is this file screwed up?
It says Dave Calhoun deck.
Right here. There we go. Thanks. Wrong click. First subject I'd just like to kick around with you, big data. This is the one I run into wherever I go. It is, in my view, the biggest both obstacle and opportunity for just about anybody in the marketing and consumer research world. And in fact, today, I would refer to it mostly as a significant problem. It's confusing. It represents the most diverse, wide-ranging interests you could ever imagine. Most people who bring big data to the table all have a self-serving interest in how to use it in some way, shape, or form. And so if you are a user, you're trying to reach a population or understand an insight with a population, you have to dissect all of those things. Like, what is the underlying interest of the party who's bringing the data to me? And why do they want it this way? And how does it relate to the 5 things next door, right? Just stop and think about Facebook's interests, Google's interests, Microsoft's interests, Apple's interests, and think about Amazon's interests, and think about the data that they have. The notion that if you could put all that data together, you could solve the world's problems. That's all true. The problem is you can't do it, right? It doesn't come to you that way. It comes to you in very different ways. Each are very productive of everything they know about a consumer, and their death sentence is sharing it to the one next door. It is a blood feud in many ways. It's fun to be on one of the teams or the other, but if you're trying to solve a broad-based marketing question or try to gain insights into consumers, it is the intersection of that data that creates insight. It's rarely one data source at a time. And so for me, I think today and probably for the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to be mostly referring. If you want a CMO job or if you want to run a company inside the CPG space or the direct-to-consumer world, I think for the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be mostly thinking about how to solve the problem as to creating big solutions. And I think that it's a very healthy debate to have, because some folks, to be honest with you, who don't really recognize both sides of this argument, go headlong into streams of data, headlong into decisions that oftentimes are just plain ill-founded, had they just had another way to corroborate or another way to think about it. Another thing about big data. Almost always, it starts with a distribution interest. Examples. Big data was around in the TV world a long time ago when set-top boxes were introduced to distribution. A set-top box, in theory, was always going to become the new metric for watching TV. Why? Because it recorded every second of delivery, and in many cases, it had a two-way street. You could actually send information back through that set-top box, and then therefore, if you could sort of analyze both sides of that transaction, you'd have enormous marketing insight. You know, here's the problem. The set-top box only ever represented what was distributed to a certain biased set of consumers. Almost always socioeconomically in a better position than the mass, almost always. So you had to understand those biases in infinite detail. The demos around the set-top box users are different than almost anything else. And so marketers aren't smart enough, don't have enough resources to try to work their way through all those things. But the biggest one is the simple fact that it's a distribution metric. And just because your set-top box is delivering media to your household doesn't mean anyone's watching it. A third of the time, the TV's not even on, right? So you don't learn much from that third. The other time, it's one maybe member of the family, or maybe it's the whole family. You have no clue what those dynamics are. And that is as important a factor in understanding TV consumption as anything else. So almost everything you see by way of big data tends to be wrapped around a single form of distribution. And so when you dig deep, make sure you understand the biases that are attached to that single form of distribution before you imply that all consumers think this way or that they're all going to act that way. Because these things are never talked about, but they exist, and they exist in very, very significant ways. It applies to what people buy. Each form of retail, including e-commerce, has its set of biases around who buys and why they buy. And you have to understand that relative to other forms of retail distribution. I think I mentioned this up front, captive versus objective, right? Who is really, what are people representing with the data that's presented or data that's available to big users? In almost every case, a captive metric or a captive set of data is there to support whatever's behind it, right? And nobody's dumb in this world. They like to give it and they like to pass it out and they want you to use it for a pretty good reason. Ultimately, they want to benefit from it. And so while there is a greater good that people do contribute to, it doesn't usually rule the day. And so everyone has to be thoughtful about captive interests in a world of big data and make sure you understand the underlying thoughts behind that. And then another one that is sort of a subject that everyone would like to forget about, but it won't happen this way, is the notion of targeting and then the subject of privacy. Targeting has, I'm 6 years into this industry. When I got here, it was pretty much said to me that targeting is the way. It's going to be the only way because technology will allow for identification of individuals. It'll tell you where they're standing on the street and what retail outlets they're next to. They'll tell you what device they're using. And then ultimately, a great marketer will be able to deliver one-on-one anything that's required. Yeah, except that not that many people actually want it that way. Because there's an awful lot of marketers that want to penetrate your veil. And they want to know all of that stuff. And marketers are not typically known for sort of social objectives, right? They want to sell you whatever they got. And they're going to try to find a way to do it. And the privacy interests are gaining lots and lots and lots of momentum. I happen to think for a very good reason. Right? I happen to think that's a good thing. And I think at the end of the day, you're going to want more time on Facebook with your friends than you're going to want with all the advertisers that would like to talk to you. And I'm pretty sure it's always going to stay that way. I think for most of the social media, for most of the search enterprises, they have sort of begun to figure out where those saturation points are. Some way overextended. I think the early versions of these kinds of things way overextended. I think the AOLs of the world crowded you out. I think the Yahoos of the world crowded you out. I think the Facebooks of the world post-IPO are going to try hard to protect their interests, but they're going to have a hard time doing it. And I think in the end, they're going to also have a tough time not crowding you out by virtue of allowing advertisers in. But that subject of targeting is gaining momentum. And interestingly, while most people would like to say that everybody, as I look around here and look at the ages, here likes being social and likes being open and likes all that, when we do all the surveys around the what ifs, i.e., there is no sort of ban on targeting, there is no protection of privacy, and everybody gets to you, it's a pretty much unanimous view that no one wants it that way. And so even the privacy interests, in my view, from communities like this are going to start to play in a very different direction. And it's a big deal. Europe has always been this way, and they will protect it, I mean, to the hilt. They will set the course. China protects it for very different reasons and probably doesn't do a very good job of it, right? And I don't think those political constraints will ever make it. But this whole notion of targeting versus privacy, I think, is a reasonably big deal. I think, as I think about this one, while I talk about it with a little bit of edge, I do think long-term it offers maybe the most potential of anything I've seen in my business life around how demand aggregates and how people think in big scale. And for a marketer, I'd probably invest a boatload of my time understanding this and moving forward and understanding what big data can offer. So another subject. This is really a broader subject around the world that I think you're going to live in and what it's going to do in businesses and how they're going to have to think differently about it. I spent 30 years of my life, 27 to be precise, a company called GE. Lots of industrial interests, a few consumer interests. Over those 30 years, I watched this sort of thing called a supply chain develop. Now, a supply chain, for those who don't know, used to be a set of functions, very distinct and deliberate. You had a purchasing group that went out and bought stuff. You had a manufacturing group that sort of took whatever they bought, added some labor, and made stuff. You had a distribution group, and then you go down the path. Never once in the early going was it thought about as a supply chain. And then for 30 years, based on the Japanese model that started down this path because it was landlocked and constrained, learned how to put all those things together in a very synchronous way. And so rather than passing across function and rather than optimizing efficiency around each one of those activities, they learned how to put it together. And they introduced new tools that the world hadn't heard of in the beginning, called Six Sigma, sort of you never make a defect. You stop the line when you have a defect. Cycle time, you compress the amount of time it takes you to get from the beginning to the end so that you're responsive to a market in every way you can think of. And for 30 years, this contributed enormous amounts of productivity and funding for lots of other things for lots of companies. And you watched it move from one industry to another industry to another industry, et cetera. And in a retail world, you watched Walmart dominate life by virtue of a supply chain strategy, right? Big scale, using information to move goods, right, more efficiently than anybody else, and they absolutely crushed the retailers across this country, at the point where they're roughly 25% of retail. I really believe that in the last decade of the last century, the benefits of supply chain optimization as a competitive differentiator pretty much lapsed. Doesn't mean you can afford not to be perfect. You have to be perfect. But everybody's perfect. Everyone's got this figured out. There's a science to it. The disciplines all came together, et cetera. So now you're in a world, you got way too much supply. You got an incredibly efficient supply chain. How do you differentiate yourself? Well, you're going to have to do it on demand. You're going to have to do it by differentiating the offerings you bring to consumers. And you're going to have to learn how to process information from consumers at a much faster pace. And you can't live with the same kind of functional deployment the world lives with today, right? You got a little marketing insights group that's in and of themselves in one place. You got a marketing and advertising crowd that's in another place that doesn't really talk to them. You've got a distribution crowd that wants to be as the most efficient distributor to every form of retail, wants to fight with every retailer about sort of how efficient they can be and where their placement ought to be on the shelf. All of these steps in the demand chain end up being disjointed. Every step in the process is a compromise. Everything about that process reminds me of the early days of the supply chain. There is no such thing as cycle time. How long it takes to process an idea and actually turn it into a product and deliver it to exactly the consumer you want to deliver it to, right? There's nothing about alignment. I've got media interests who look at you as an audience. I got retail interests who look at you as a shopper, interested in your trip. And I've got these consumer brands that think about you as a consumer. All of them are vying for your attention, and rarely do the three line up. And it is, in my view, in the demand chain, it's the notion of what a demand chain is, ownership for a demand chain inside a company, and then the processing and alignment of all those interests that is going to create enormous value over the next 20, 30 years. I think it will happen exactly the same way it happened in the supply chain. But it will require a slightly different mix of skills inside the marketing world and the CEO world and consumer businesses. And it's going to have to want to apply some level of discipline to what is mostly considered an advertising-driven, creative, anecdotal world. It really is the way most big marketing programs move. It really is where most success, all the badges of courage, are built around one great idea that everyone jumped on. It was one great campaign. It made a big difference. But those things come and go. And at the end of the day, it's this notion of a big chain where you, in my view, can create great competitive advantage. This couldn't happen. Just the thought of putting them together wouldn't do much for you. But the technology that you guys have all grown up with and the ability to assess where latent demands exist and emerging demands are cropping up, i.e. social networks, the discussion we just had on big data, in my view, the skills that pursue those forums, those information sources, the ability to identify demand aggregation, which happens at light speed today, the ability to do that and process it quickly into a big company to deliver something, to me is going to be the great differentiator, right? And if without the technology, if I didn't see social networks evolving, if I didn't see search working the way it works, if I didn't see any of that happening, I'd say this demand chain thing's probably dead on arrival, because there just isn't a great way to get it started. And all demand chains require something to get them started. The demand landscape, just a comment about the way I think about this one. Most needs, if you stop and think about it, over the years have been built around sort of products. You have a product. Companies like Nielsen did a horrible job of comparing your product against all like products. And we call them segments and categories. And we began to define them in sort of narrow sets, and everybody wanted to know how they were doing against each other, right? And so they compete for the stakes that exist across that set of products, and they beat each other over the head. Innovation now and then, not always, but lots of strategies ultimately gain share. That's not really the way to think about markets in these spaces. The real way to think about it is built around need states. Need states are really hard to figure out, right? So exactly what are you doing when you want the bottle of Gatorade? If you're running, you just finished, and you go by a retail outlet, you're going to pay them anything for that bottle, right? If that's what you want. It's a need state, satisfied. It's at the one end of the spectrum. But you'll pay them anything. You get any price point you want, as long as it's there and it's ready and it appeals to the need state. This is the way the world has to start to begin to think and segment, right? You have to know what the need states are of shoppers that want the stuff that you ultimately deliver, so that it expands your mind, expands your thinking, and at the end of the day, creates the need for alignment amongst retail, amongst manufacturers, amongst brands, et cetera. Everybody wants to appeal to a need state, including the media. The media programmers are always trying to satisfy your need states. That's where you can begin to build alignment. You need a premise on how to build alignment. In my view, the old-fashioned ways of looking at market shares and the product descriptions and the categories that exist, by the way, I make a lot of money doing it, right? But I think those are yesterday, and I don't think they're going to exist. I think the folks who can navigate the social world and navigate all the information that's available to create these are going to differentiate themselves and differentiate the companies they work with. I talked a little bit about alignment. A comment on neighborhood. Almost all of the retail world that exists today, absent e-commerce, was built around the neighborhood, right? It was each neighborhood had a certain set of demographics, socioeconomics attached to it, and the retail outlet sprung up because it appealed to that crowd. It did a lot of research to find out who they were, and it built itself to cater to those needs. And today, as you guys all know, that's actually not quite the way demand forms anymore. It's not neighbor talking to neighbor literally. Yes, that still happens. But the big dynamic in the world today is neighbor talking to neighbor virtually, right? The notion of demand aggregation. It all happens socially. It happens on all your Facebook conversations and every other network opportunity that you're involved in. You probably all got a dozen of them. So the notion of where demand forms and aggregates is a different notion. And I think today it's a virtual notion. It's no longer that physical notion. And fortunately, the folks like Amazon and the folks who know how to deliver across that spectrum, they've got all the advantages, mostly built around that notion, in my view. So, tons of new tools, rarely discussed about the multidisciplined approach that has to be taken, in my view, to uncork the demand-driven world that is going to come. Just a note about measurement for anybody who thinks they might dabble in it. So where does measurement create value? The easy one for people to think about is insights. It's the aha. I went out, I did a piece of research, I found out that certain consumers like this color on this time of day and they want it in this form or function, and boom, somebody seizes on it and they get it, and it's a wonderful insight. Or the other guy's beaten me in a big way and I don't even know it. Thank you. Now we'll figure out how to battle that one. Actually, most of the great efficiencies driven from information come out of pure measurement. It is, in fact, the ability of major players invested in winning with consumers beating each other to death to win the consumer. And the fact that measurement equalizes that score, it tells them when they're winning, when they're losing. It allows them to compete more efficiently. They go at it more proactively and hopefully are focused on the right targets, because that's the nature of what goes on. In the television world, I think it's a miracle, a total miracle, that every day advertising is bought and sold on our metric. Every day, advertisers go out and sell their properties and their programs based on yesterday's ratings to marketers interested in reaching those consumers. I mean, it's one of the most amorphous measures you'll ever want to get, right? Yes, it's accurate. Yes, I'm proud of it. But somehow the industry gravitated to it. Why? Because it uncorked the advertising dollars and it funneled them to media companies in the biggest way you could imagine. And now those media companies have developed all forms of content and done all the things that are sort of wonderful for all of you. But it is the notion of currency that allows for industries to get efficient and to form. And when we think about our world and marketing information, we start with that premise, which is where might you create a currency so that an industry performs at a higher level. Today, for us, that's display advertising in the publishing world. There is no currency, there's no accountability, there's no way for anyone to know exactly what they got when they ran their display ads across your social networking space. So for us, that notion of trying to create a currency, the task is 10 times as hard, the odds are against you, but if you ever get there, it uncorks enormous value, and those tend to be the big bets in measurement and marketing information. Only other point I'd like to make on this one is on the last one. Advertising. Most people think about it as paid. What is paid? I pay you to run an ad on the service that you created. Almost everybody thinks about it that way. And it turns out the real big shift going on in terms of consumer influence is actually in this area, which is all the conversations you have in the social world and the notion that something a company did, some idea that prospered, they promoted, whatever, got your attention. And you created the media. You created the advertisement by virtue of the discussions you had virtually. And that notion of earned media is a very powerful notion. If you get it right, you pay nothing for it, and your market explodes. Old Spice, right? Simple, simple notion. Axe before that. Not sure what it is about that category, but it obviously knows how to explode in virtual, right? But that's just the beginning, and this will go on and on and on. So the leverage in advertising, in my view, is actually going to get significant when people learn how to explode with earned and how to influence it and how to use it. And at the same time, when it goes against you, and it does, how to, in some way, shape, or form, soften the blow. Because mostly we talk about the big examples, the bad ones are just as tough. And demand drops like a rock in those situations. So it's a very interesting phenomena. John Wanamaker, a long time ago, said 50% of all advertising is wasted. I think almost every ad person still believes that's true. And I think that will also feed this notion of paid versus earned, and in my view, the drift toward earned. This is the last subject, and I don't want to turn over your questions. CMOs. I did want to give you a perspective because Ravi told me you've had lots of them here, and there may be a bunch of you who want to be CMOs. I don't think that any of them would disagree with me. It's one of the shortest tenured jobs there is in almost every industry, but in particular in the CPG industry. I say for good reason, and I don't mean to say that in a sort of challenging way, but the reason is simple. It has built itself around the successful campaign. It really has. Unfortunately, as CMOs think about their lives and their prospects, they mostly are hunting for the campaign that's the winner, the big differentiator, the one that exploded during my watch, we gained a bunch of share, and I'm the idea guy, or I promoted the idea people, right? And it's unfortunately, that's really not what sustains companies. There has to be a broader view of what that is. In my view, the job should own the demand chain. It should define itself that way. It should say to itself on day one, I own the retail relationship. I own media placement. I own all those things. I own all the inside organizations, and my job is going to be to line them up in a way no one else has lined them up. And yes, I have to be creative. There is always a creative element that's going to differentiate. But these other things sustain, and they sustain in a very big way. And somebody's got to commit themselves to it. And if you don't, in my view, it's going to stay short-lived, and the tenure is going to rotate. And what happens to most of them is they rotate from one to the next to the next to the next. And this is the way it works. And I've witnessed it firsthand for the last 6 years, and as I trace it the 10 years before, that's pretty much the way it works. So there's nothing wrong with it, and it's not to say they are not brilliant in the work that they do, but until they take a bigger, more comprehensive view of it and own it and elevate it in a different way, I don't think you're going to have sort of the sustained performance that you would hope. The only other comment I would make is the agency dependency. Almost all CMOs are, because first of all, they start with that notion of campaign. They become incredibly dependent on agencies. Because the agencies, for the most part, have fed all the campaign ideas. They're really good at the work they do. I actually love the creative side of agency, and I think there's always a big place for it. It's just that you can't become completely dependent on it, right? If you're a CMO, you're going to have to mix it up, find lots of agencies to support you in every way you can, and also understand that there are a lot of changes going on that agencies have to deal with. And most of it relates to earned media and the social world, because they don't make a penny on that one. And if they feed it and it works, they lose. It's real simple. And so that whole notion of how to think about that dynamic is important, I think, for most. And I talk about operational alignment and discipline. I happen to think the CMO job just simply has to elevate and think about itself as a supply chain leader. And then they'll start to evolve into becoming COOs. And as the supply chain links with or the demand chain links with the supply chain, they will be the logical candidates to run all the companies. Anyway, that's a view. I'm not sure how it strikes the folks in the room, so I'll be happy to turn it over to you for Q&A. Oh, yep. Thoughts? Yep.
So the shift from paid media to earned media, do you think that's going to be what drives the change in the CMO's role? Because, I mean, owning the quality of the product, the quality of the customer's experience with the company, either through servicing that product down the road, anything like that impacts the experience, which impacts your earned media company.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. Yeah, I don't know what dynamic actually shifts it. What I would say is that if I were doing this, right, if I just got an inkling this is something I want to do with my career, and I did it at a big CPG company, I would start in the social networking world. I would surround myself with every smart thought that comes out of it. I wouldn't rely on any one of them, but I would steep myself in every way I could think of on it. And I would watch the dynamics of earned media. And remember, it works both ways. I would have a very clear view as to sort of when it goes well and why it goes well and where it goes, and similarly for the downturn. I think all great insight is going to get derived that way, right? It's going to get derived that way. And then, yes, you have to drive it right through the experience, because almost all bad earned media is from a bad experience, almost all of it. Lousy product, bad distribution, didn't show up, you disappointed me on a holiday, blah, blah, blah. Almost always that's the case. And so it introduces you to the sort of the brand in different ways. Stuff you don't control, but you have to assume you do control. And if you don't control it, you should influence it, right? Every day, all day. And that's what leaders in the marketing world have to begin to want to own. So I think it's a great starting point. I'm not sure it's the one that cracks it, but I think it's a great place to start.
I'm just wondering, the goal of shortening the demand chain, in that case, can scale hurt you? Like for companies that have to execute on a really large scale, is that something that hinders that shortening?
Yeah. Scale, it's a great question. Scale always works against speed. It just does. But scale offers lots of other advantages, right? My notion is that the big scale players have garnered big advantages from their scale and have great positions. And I am certain with just a little work, they can get faster. I am really sure of it. So I just say, if you're this successful at scale, if you're twice as fast as you are, you're going to be that much better. And so that's the way you sort of think about that dynamic. But there's no question small facilitates speed in every way you can think of. I think about a great idea that comes out of the market Usually there's an insights group inside these companies. They're paid to go find this stuff. And or the agency world is loaded with them and they feed the system. You can't believe how these ideas sit for long periods of time being analyzed and overanalyzed every way you can think of. And I think about that idea. I paid somebody a fair amount of money to go find it, do all that stuff. I think about it like inventory. If I were running a supply chain, I would see the stack of inventory, right? That's what Japan did. They didn't have enough room for all the inventory, so they just kept working on cycles so they wouldn't have it, right? But what happens in the ideal world, things get stacked, and different agendas get in the way. And so there is no notion of supply chain folks, there's these tack time measures and all this stuff. All of them are designed to move stuff through fast as you can move it through. None of that exists on idea prosecution in big companies. None of it. So my view is you have to learn how to harness it. You always have to incent it. Big companies have a hard time incenting innovation, but you have to. But then the big deal is how fast you prosecute it. It's got to move from idea to very quick, thorough evaluation, straight into innovation, and you've got to start delivering against it. And today's world, you get that cycle, has to be short. The big finding here for, I think, anybody is they don't have a clue what it is. None of them. They truly don't. There's no measure of cycle on any of that. None. Not until it finally gets to somebody who was designated to design the product. Then the day starts, right? Then the clock starts. Everything before that is sits. And that whole notion of again, time, speed, cycle, I think is incredibly powerful. And it will become the grounds for competition in these years ahead, I believe. Yeah.
You mentioned need states, and just from my experience working with different companies, many companies are already targeting through attitudinal or behavioral metrics.
Yeah.
But Nielsen, whether it's TV ratings or supermarket scanning, is still reporting on demographics, and I know you do link it in certain ways.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about that process of how you get to match up with the marketer's target and how your reporting is changing to match that?
So this is a great subject. That has been one of the big breakdowns. We created these market structures, as I said. They don't really cater well to a whole new definition built around need states. But because the technology is what it is, most of the reporting systems, certainly our reporting systems, have now been all changed to where, in effect, every query on a gigantic database goes right down to granular data and configures it any way it wants based on the question, just like a search, right? So the technology that underlies share reporting is now capable of shifting in very dramatic ways and very quickly to all new forms of reporting. Now what do we face? We face clients who have built their entire operating system around the old way we used to do it, right? And so you have category managers. You have a category manager inside the retailer. So in effect, that market structure, they built an entire operating system around. And now what we have to do is push as hard as we can and get the support and help from the marketers to define the landscape the best way they know how. And then we can respond to that challenge and get the whole financial reporting system lined up that way. So within a need state, what are the products that feed that need state? What are that competitive set of products on a need state? It could be in a whole different category, right? It could be a very different form of snack. It could be a very different form of thirst quench. But we have to be able to do that. So we have to be able to do it. So the technology today is there. Now we have to help everybody go at the operating systems. The one that has been most innovative with us has been Hershey. Hershey has had a real run. They did some very innovative things on defining need states that supported them with retailers and others. It's really, in our view, our first application of demand chain thinking in our reporting. And they have had a heck of a run for the last couple of years. And I believe this has some role in that success. Yeah.
You talked a lot about sort of goals and challenges for the industry as a whole and your clients. I'm curious what sort of the key goal and challenges for Nielsen are in the next few years.
Yeah, so it's all of the above. My biggest challenge was really the first slide, that big data notion. because it creates enormous confusion. It really does. Our fundamental premise, we have two really fundamental things that we do that, in my view, are just both can sustain themselves for a long period of time, but they have to adapt to the world around them. One of them is the audience measurement thing we do. Again, traded on every day, all day, so forth, so on. We have to include every available screen in that fundamental metric, right? It's not TV versus the computer versus the iPad versus the mobile. It's none of that. It's best available, because that's how you think about it, right? I'm just going to watch whatever I want to watch wherever I am based on. So, the technology to do that is actually not very hard. So we've done it, we've proven it with lots of people, and then the hard part in trying to get it accepted as a currency is the industry interests about who gets credit for that new audience. Is it the cable distributor or is it the media content provider? Who's going to get the editing content? We have these editing rules that basically parcel out all of those values. That's where the big fight is today. I think we will navigate them, and I think in the end we'll get to that because it's just so necessary, right? You have audiences moving and shifting, and it's the comment I made before about measurement. The whole system will lose if we don't all agree to get it right. And while, yes, there will be individual winners and losers when we make those trades, the whole industry is going to have to finally accept it. And then there will be one leap of faith somewhere in that process that we'll have to make it happen, and then there will be a third of our clients just bitter because somebody else benefited. And that is the way it'll work, I think. So, yeah.
I wonder if you had any thoughts about the trends in terms of content online and whether media outlets will still be relying on ads or consumers are starting to be willing to pay for content online.
Yeah. So I actually think we may just be at a tipping point right now. Paid has been working pretty well. And lots of new forms of content distribution are trying to lean into that model. But the one, of course, that we all know, cable, has sort of saturated the world. And you'll be very interested to know that the biggest dynamic right now in the viewing world is the growth of antennas. Why? Because it's gotten so costly to receive a cable network, and given the plight that's going on in the country, antenna sales are going through the roof. And believe it or not, there is, in fact, some cord cutting, and there are, in fact, and by the way, anybody here use an antenna signal here recently? It is good. It's as good as or better than what you get on cable. It really is. So there's some very funny things going on there. My own view is that there's probably still more room for paid distribution, subscription models. There are so many competing interests, and they represent narrow forms of content that those bills add up. And so the consumer is making decisions all day long about what they can afford, and do I want breadth or do I want that single pipe? I believe we're at a bit of a tipping point. I think we're saturated on paid. And if it keeps going, it's going to go at a much slower pace. So the ad-supported model is very important. It's going to have to. I think it's going to have to stay that way. Yeah.
Yeah. When we were asking CEOs or CFOs all these numbers about profitability, ROE, ROA, they're always very clear about what those numbers are. But when you ask about customer numbers, such as attrition, customer value, customer base, growth, they pay little attention to it. So my question to you is, how come a lot of high-level managers don't focus on the core, which should be the customer base, the customer numbers? That translating to.
Have you read Bob Lutz's book? Or have you read Bob Lutz's book or seen him? So he's the former vice chair of General Motors. He actually ran just about every automotive company. He just wrote a book on that subject, which is sort of the bean counters versus the look, I do have a lot of theories on this one. I can make it as clear as I can. Look, there's a lot of ambition in the world. The easiest route to success is to use the sure path, the sure set of numbers. Everybody, not for whatever reason, for obvious reasons, has to make financial numbers. The accounting system is perfectly balanced. It's precise. No judgment required. I got too much inventory over there. I didn't do well enough over here. My operating margins slight there. It's actually the easiest thing in the world, right? And I'm sure the finance part of the school would shoot me for that, but it is, right? So all that stuff's easy, but that's how most careers are made, right? Numbers get better. Take dramatic action on supply chains. That's why the supply chain thing was sort of easy to put together, right? It's so easy to flesh out the benefits, and the numbers all support it every way you can think of. The customer stuff gets a little warm and fuzzy, right? It changes sometimes, and you don't know why, right? And so you have to do all kinds of research to go find out why. And it requires judgment every step of the way. Really good domain judgment has to be applied to get to the right conclusion from a lot of the customer-based stuff. I happen to think the great leaders actually do pay lots of attention to that. I think they get it. I think they all get it. But I agree with you, it's not the majority, not by any stretch of the imagination. And there is some point in your career or your growth where you have to make that leap of faith. You just do. And for you, in this world, it seems easy. But when you get out in that world and all the measures are coming on you and the investors are pouring on you, I mean, poor Bob McDonald. I bet he didn't get a single question at Procter & Gamble on this last earnings call that got bombarded. I'm sure he didn't get a single customer question. Not one. But he feels like his life's in his hands, right? And so this is the natural implication of all of that. And I just think it requires big, strong leaders to understand and know that if you want to build a sustaining operation, you got to get the customer numbers right. I do think Net Promoter Score was the first widely accepted metric on that subject.
And there's a lot of correlation between high net promoter scores and...
It's always correlation. It's a question of timing. There's always correlation. If you're living in the multi-year, it's perfect. If you're living in a quarter or even an annual, it's not so perfect, right? And that's where the fight is. And it goes on all day long. And those of you guys have all done stuff in business. You know that's what goes on, right? So it takes fortitude to overcome it. It takes fortitude to plow your way through it. I do think it's always rewarded. I happen to think it's always rewarded, but it's really uncomfortable going from here to there. Yeah.
You mentioned that the real value is in insights. Can you talk a little bit about Nielsen's strategy and particularly the shift from data provider to service provider?
Yeah. So for us, the way we think about insights is the cross of watch and buy. It's the so what of all the work you do in watch, all of that audience work you do, all the collection of insights for advertisers. What is it worth? What do you get for it? And what data is most reliable in marrying against that to find out whether there's any real ROI going on in the marketing function. That is where we're going to sort of make our nest. We refer to it as advertising solutions. I'm not interested in custom insight. I don't want the one-time, oh gosh, we found out this one thing on this one product, this one place. There's lots of work that goes on in that space. We want to try to create metrics that allow for a continuous improvement to go on inside an advertiser's shop around brand effect and those kinds of things. One trap that I think a lot of people fall into in thinking about marketing and measurement, and I'll relate this to the CFO discussion. ROI, return on investment, right? Everybody's enamored with it. It's that subject, and the discussion's been around for a very long time. ROI cannot be applied to discrete forms of advertising or sales promotion, in my view. Every time you do the discrete work, what am I getting for my promotion? What am I getting for my publishing display? My display ads in the publishing world? What am I getting for TV? That set of numbers tells you one thing about one channel. And if you get in the habit of saying this ROI is higher than that ROI, let's stage right. And this is what goes on. It goes on all the time. And when the CFOs peek into the marketing world, this is what they tell them to do, right? But the way marketing really works, and I think you can appreciate it, it's a symphony, period. And the only ROI that matters is the combination of all the above. That's the only thing that matters. And you have to think about it like a controlled experiment. Every day, all day, every week. You keep certain things constant and you change other things. And you watch what happens. Is my ROI getting better or not? And then you continue to shift and you continue to measure. And the measurements today are getting good enough to be able to run that controlled experiment in a continuous way. I don't think about measurements as sort of one for each stack. I try not to think about it that way. I try to think about how you can sort of create a framework to continue to run that controlled experiment, to operate like a supply chain does. Tweak this, find out what it's worth 3 weeks later. Make another change, find out what it's worth. That's really, you'd be sort of surprised at how in arrears most marketing mix decisions are actually made. It's usually data that they collect from 3 months of history or 6 months of history. It's a set of analytics that goes on for another 3 months. And then there's a leap of faith that we're going to shift to 5% more display ad and 2% less TV ad. And then you got to wait another 3 months until you find out whether it works. You know, that's just an old world. It's an old system. I'm part of it. I do things in all parts of it. But the new world has to get to that notion of, I think, controlled experiment and ROI in a holistic way. How do you contribute to it in a favorable way? What detracts from it? And move and move. I'll give you one last example. I was telling Ravi, when we started to create a new metric for the display advertising world, we were doing it largely at the request of Facebook for obvious reasons. The Facebook folks knew that if they had a really good metric and a measure, that the value of all that inventory would lift. There'd be fewer discounting just on the basis of that. And then she said to me, this is Sheryl Sandberg, who was one of the spectacular leaders of our time. She says to me, and I want all the TV money, right? Because that's what you do. That's where all the big advertising money is. And I want all that. And I said to Sheryl, I said, you know, I beg to differ. I think there's a very different way to thinking about this. The biggest dynamic going on in the TV world is the number of people that are on Facebook at the same time. That's the dynamic. I said, you have a relationship with TV. I'm not sure you understand it or how to think about it. But if you get bold about it and begin to sell your relationship with TV in addition to just the raw power of display ads, you now have a sort of a double value game, right? And they play that hard now. And it's just that's what's going on, right? It's never one medium by itself, ever. It never is. It's always the combination, and it's always the great marketer knows how to play them together.
Can we switch maybe for the last few minutes on leadership questions? So you obviously stayed at the same company for a long time, which is unusual these days. Any advice to people, like, you know, what is it, how does one, you know, what are the different things you decide when you manage your careers?
Yeah, I'm. You know, I have a view on this subject, and it's all built around actually what you're leaving right now. You have to just figure out how to find a learning environment and know that you are getting challenged every day to learn more. And more importantly, you wake up every day trying to learn more. That's the whole thing. I got lucky because I got in the year Welsh took over GE. Welsh inherited this wonderful leadership development thing, but then he just put it on steroids in every way you could think of. And so for me, I found myself in one of those sort of throw him in the pool as deep as he can go, find out if he can figure it out or learn anything about it. And as soon as he looks like he's up for air, let's throw him in another one, right? And so he used his company as a laboratory to develop people. It's just this is the way it works. So he liked the idea of moving somebody from one industry to another. When I think about the learning that I may have now or that I exercise today, or that I exercised inside my GE world, I ever hardly took an idea from my near competitor, applied it to my business, and then sort of won, right? If I was in the aviation world and I was up against Pratt & Whitney, who was up the road, and I tried to steal an idea from them, I might get 0.1% better, 0.1%, if I'm lucky. During my tenure in that aviation business, Welsh sent me to Walmart, of all places, right? And he had me attend a Saturday morning meeting with all of their store managers who all flew in on Friday from the regions around the country, who had all just shopped at all the competitor stores over the course of the week and did some analytics around what displays are winning and which ones are losing. And they had this meeting on Saturday morning with all merchandisers, all the supply chain folks, everybody, bantering back and forth what's working, what's not, what the competitor did, so forth. And then on Monday, all strategies change, all new displays are formed, and they're delivered over the course of that early part of the week. This is like one of the great sort of, big company things I've ever seen in my life. And we refer to it as quick market intelligence. And the learning you get from something like that, going back to an aviation business that develops a jet engine for 10 years, introduces it to a market, and then sells spare parts for 35 years, right? You say to yourself, what could possibly you learn? Except that what we decided to do is we called up every service guy in the entire company, and we got them on a big call Monday morning every week. And we did our own form of what we call quick market intelligence. Because big long cycle companies get slow, sloppy, stale. It's just the nature of the beast. The guys in the middle and the ones that are highest up, they end up to be the most disconnected from the real action. And the real action happens on the runway. So we took this quick market intelligence concept and we brought it to the world's slowest business inside that network, and we sped it up every way you could think of. And it would be hard for me to describe the number of benefits that we garnered from that and the advantages that we believe we sustained because of that. But most learning goes from industry to industry, I happen to think. Because it's an industry who's dealing with a survival question that is going to come up with the best answer. That's the crowd you want to go find. That's who you want to learn from, and then you translate. So I lived in that environment, and that's the way it worked. And then I had this one thing. I knew I was going to leave before I was 50. I made the call to do it. Why in the world would you go to a big LBO in the market research space? Because this thing on the West Coast just totally fascinated me, right? Facebook fascinates me. Google fascinates me. Apple fascinates me. Industries that are just exploding because they've redefined they've given leverage to consumers. Simple as that. That's their key to life. In the late 90s, you may recall, there was this word called disintermediation. All the dot-coms are going to disintermediate all the big companies. What did they do? They basically used internet technology to displace supply chains. None of them survived. The ones that survived are the ones that started with the demand side. All they did, that's all they did, was worry about creating an enormous pool of consumers built on satisfying their direct needs. Nothing more. Didn't make a buck, didn't have a business model, nothing. But that's what happened. And this huge thing is happening right before my eyes. And if you come from my world, industrial, call it whatever you want, this is all new stuff. It's like the most new stuff you could ever think of, right? And I just think about it, all I did was go down again. And you hope you come up for air. But I just think there's a good luck with that thing. Hey, you just wonder. We got it, yeah. Good side. Yeah. So anyway, my advice on that subject is to just keep burying yourself in difficult, tough situations where the learning is intense.
Any other last question of the day, of the semester? Of the
This
year?
is it. It's done. It's over. They're dying to get out of here.
All right.
Good.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.